Good evening and welcome to the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life, our Faith and Science Roundtable. I am the Reverend Dr. Mike Hegeman, and tonight I am joined with David Schaller, and he is one of our congregation members here at Pinnacle Presbyterian Church, as well as a kind of founding member of the Faith and Science Roundtable here at Pinnacle Presbyterian Church. Tonight, our topic is Isaac Newton, this Isaac Newton's Strange God. And I think I gave it that title just to entice you to come, because his God is not that strange, but it's a little unorthodox. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, his not his stepping away from orthodoxy in his views of God. Many people do not know that Isaac Newton had a strong theological side. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. So we're really glad you're here and welcome. And I'll speak for a little while, and then David will come up and speak, and then we have question time, where we'll move the microphone around the room and you can ask whatever questions you have, okay? So, starting right away, just wanted to say that David and I have been reading multiple books for this. We thought of this topic a few months ago, and we were so excited about it. And the more we got into it, the more we got a little overwhelmed, right? Just thinking, wow, this man's thought and his work is massive and has had big impact through the years. And so you'll see on the screen, this is the first book up there, The Priest of Nature, is one that David will talk a little bit more about. He's been reading that. I read this book, Isaac Newton, by James Gleick, I don't know how to say that. And then other ones, Isaac Newton, the Alchemist, and Isaac Newton, the Last Sorcerer. So we'll unpack a little bit as we go through that, all the sides, mathematician, alchemist, prophet, all kinds of things for Isaac Newton. All right, let's see where we are. Keep moving. Isaac Newton, first of all, we know him as a scientist. I'm going to hand that to my assistant over here for a moment. All right, thank you, David. Okay, so Isaac Newton, the scientist, and this is what we really know, and David will speak more about this, but that I did a little research and I said, well, how is Isaac Newton presented to children? And so I read through all of that, and I thought, well, you usually see a graphic of or a picture of Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree, and what happens? The apple tree falls and hits him on the head or something like that. And he says, I've discovered gravity. The story is more complex than that, right? So what we know about in his major works, like the Principia Mathematica, that he discovers, universal gravitation. We see all kinds of things like inverse distance squared law. He wrote much about the light and optics. Dave will talk about things performing his own original experiments on light. He invented calculus. He rejected the authority of the Greek philosopher Aristotle and promoted experiment-based science. So what we don't know is that Isaac Newton, too, was a theologian, and the very few people knew that. So here's some of the things we say about that, is that he was a devout Christian and had deep thoughts about God. Probably those words, I'm not sure if they're too small for you. Never leaves the Anglican Church. But his views on religion may have gotten him certainly in trouble if they were known at the time with the Anglican Church, the Church of England at that time. So, as we go along, though, one of the topics we're not going to delve in too much is that Isaac Newton was also an alchemist. Dum, 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 right? Alchemist, at that time, many, especially we think of alchemists as the Middle Ages, right? An age of superstition, when people were trying to figure out how do you transform one metal into another, take something common and change it into a precious metal, or to find the elixir of life, or the philosopher's stone, all these kinds of things. It's on the side of magic and all of that. Isaac Newton wasn't far enough removed from that he didn't find it unusual for himself to be associated with alchemy. So in the midst of that, scientist, theologian, alchemist, right, of all things. But here, as I think we put that in there, theology, prophecy, and alchemy, he wrote more on those subjects than on science. Think about that. See if the slide is up there. Yes. Okay, he wrote more. This is really unbelievable, because what we know from his work is all about science. But he did write more on theology, prophecy, and that prophecy means is he read the book of Revelation and Daniel again and again and again, and he was trying to figure out when these things were going to happen. So he was big on the book of Revelation in his writings. So I want to put Newton into my job is to, since the science is really beyond me, my role as resident, smart guy on, no, I don't mean smart, no, theologian. I'm not going to say I'm a biblical scholar, but by just my knowledge of theology, I want to put him into history and the context of his theology. So first of all is that I just found this out today. Newton was born on the day that Galileo Galilei died. Yeah, so, and the reason that's important is that Galileo is one who is really persecuted by the church for his scientific views. And when I say the church, at that time, that's Roman Catholicism, which has greater control over Western Europe at that time. And he's made to recount his ideas that the earth goes around the sun. He says eventually he was arrested and tried, and under house arrest, he eventually had to recant all of his scientific findings. That's Galileo, right? And so I bring him up because Newton is born in a time not too far removed from the church and science really at odds with one another. And so as we move into the next slide, I said, well, who was king of England? What was going on in England at this time? And so we just go right away. You'll see that he was born under the reign of Charles I. May not mean much to you, but Charles I, he gets so excited he loses his head. No, he loses his head, but he's you can see by his dates there, he dies in 1649. This is a time in the 1640s, the first few years of Newton's life, that there is great turmoil in England and civil war all through the 40s. And so that Charles I does lose his head in 1649, and there's what comes next is an interregnum, that means between kings, interregnum, and the Commonwealth. And what's going on here is this real struggle between how Catholic is the monarchy going to be and is England going to be, how Protestant is it going to be. And there's this struggle back and forth. And how much power do the kings have? And so the divine right of kings keeps raising its sneaky head here, and the people but the people are beginning to feel like, we want to question this whole idea of divine right of kings. And so you'll see a quick succession of monarchs as we go along. There's the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Oliver Cromwell, who was this big, he was part of that whole move to get rid of the monarchy and have an independence actually with the church, from the church. People somehow, they don't like change, and they bring back the monarchy. 1660, then we have the reign of Charles II. And then as we move further, James II. And he was deposed after 3 years because he was too Catholic. Now remember, Henry VIII, back in 1530s, got rid of the Catholic Church and made the Church of England, wasn't too Protestant yet, but in the 1500s, more and more Protestant. But there's this tug for couple hundred years. How Catholic, how Protestant is the monarchy going to be? Is the church going to be? Is England going to be? James II, he gets too Catholic, and so he's deposed. And from that point on, all of these others, they're searching for people who could rule England who weren't going to be Catholic. There might have been somebody closer in line, birthright-wise, but they were Catholics. And so the England had to keep looking further and further afield. So we get these folks like William and Mary, William of Orange and Mary, his wife, and they are co-regnants, reign together. Then Queen Anne, and she's the last of the Stuart line because she doesn't have an heir. And when I say Stuart line, that's Henry VIII, all the way up to this present time, 1714. And then they can't find anybody who isn't a Catholic. So they go over to Germany to find the great-grandson of James I from Scotland, right? Who wrote the King James Bible. He didn't write. He's responsible for authorizing the King James Bible. His great-grandson is the closest Protestant relative they can find over there in England, George I, from which we get George II, and then George III, Mad King George, right? Yeah, so the thing is that all of this, I wanted to say all this because it becomes very important, the struggles between the monarchy, the people, and the church, how Catholic, how Protestant, and how Presbyterian it's going to be. So we'll get there in just a moment. So quickly, literary context of the time. Let's see. I'm just trusting those slides are changing behind me. No, literary, no. Okay, we'll get there eventually. Oh, they didn't. Okay. So we're at the literary, is there? Super. Okay, so just real quick, think William Shakespeare in the late 1500s, early 1600s. The King James Bible then coalesces and is published around 1611. John Donne, a famous kind of poet, theologian poet, dies around 1630. George Herbert, another poet from the church, 1633. Then John Milton, a little closer to Newton's time, writing Paradise Lost. He dies in 1674. And then John Bunyan, who writes, Pilgrim's Progress, dying around 1688. And so these are the kind of precursors of Newton. And what they do is they're writing books that both support and challenge the role of the church in society. How Catholic are we going to be? How churchy are we going to be? How much freedom of thought do we have? All right? And each one of those, whether in poetic ways or not, is really exploring faith and religion. So let's make sure if we got Isaac and the Catholic in the Church of England. Okay, good. You're nodding. Thank you. So Isaac, he is born into a family in which he's raised in the Church of England. We say Anglican in America, that's the Episcopal Church. Okay, he's raised in that. His father dies 3 months before he's born. His mother remarries, and he doesn't really like his stepfather, so he goes to live with an uncle who is an Episcopal priest, an Anglican priest. And he learns a lot of these, so he's got a lot of influence of church people throughout his life. He goes to Cambridge and studies and quickly moves through that bachelor to master's degree phase. They call them different things like scholar and fellow and something else. But he's moving up the ranks really quickly at a young age, very, very smart. And the thing that's really interesting here is that when he agrees to kind of be a professor there, he has to, two things he has to do. He has to swear to, and we'll get to that slide in a second, the 39 articles of the church. He has to agree saying, I will take holy orders, I'll become a priest within 7 years, and he takes a vow of celibacy. I don't know if yeah, that's up there. So think about that. I was talking to some folks yesterday as I was preparing for this, thinking about, wow, professors at that time at Cambridge and Oxford all had to take a vow of celibacy. They couldn't marry. And there's lots I tried to find out, well, why? Because the Catholic Church, all of the monasteries had been closed 200 years before, 150 years before. King Henry VIII got rid of all the monasteries and said the clergy can now marry. So wait a minute, why is it that these professors couldn't marry? Well, there's these holdovers of tradition. They said I researched and it said, well, maybe these guys, the universities didn't have room for professors' families. They didn't have housing for them. And they weren't allowed to be away from the university more than 2 or 3 weeks of the whole year. And so they said, it couldn't possibly, it's too distracting to have families. I think there's more going on. Again, remember this struggle between the church always ran the universities. And everybody who was a professor was also a priest or a monk or something. They took holy orders. And that one I didn't realize till researching this, that just didn't leave the universities. But with Isaac Newton, we get a shift. At a certain point, several years into his professorship, he just says, look, I'm not going to be a priest. And he had to appeal to the king, Charles II, I think at this point, has to appeal to him and say, help me out here. And Charles actually agrees and says, okay, in that specific professorship, whoever comes after, you don't have to become a priest, and nobody in your professorship has a special name ever has to again. So, but this is a shift. Maybe 100 years later, all of that is gone. Celibacy is gone for these professors. But this is the way it is for Isaac Newton. So I'm just really intrigued by all of this. I bring it all up to show you the tug and pull between the religious life and the secular life and how that influences why we don't know about his theological thought, all right? Because he hides it all. Because he doesn't fit or conform with the church at that time. So real quick then, what else is going on at this time? We have something called the Westminster Confession of Faith. Any good Presbyterians in the room? Oh, sorry. All right. Who know about that? Couple raise their hand here. This Westminster Confession of Faith the process begins in 1643. And get this, we Americans, this doesn't make sense to us. But the House of Lords and the House of Commons kind of work together to say, we need to set the church right and get our theology in order. So we're talking about, we can imagine if the House of Representatives and the Senate said, okay, American church, we're gonna set down the rules for all thought and action in the church. And that's what's going on in the 1640s. And it takes them about 7 or 8 years and to get it all done. And they come up with this document called a confession, which says, this is what we believe, and more than this is what we believe, this is what you're supposed to believe, right? The church in Scotland adopts it right away, and the church in England is struggling because they don't know how Presbyterian to be or how Anglican to be, and they're just tugging back and forth. That doesn't mean anything to you right now. Don't worry about it. Just say that's a struggle in the church. How the Church of England, how Presbyterian, how Anglican to be, how Catholic to be, back and forth. And so he's born into the midst of the constant struggles. So I'm going to pull us on quickly to the next slide and see if this makes you laugh. Newton, the Arian, did Santa Claus slap a Presbyterian? All right, let me tell you that story. Is that there? It is, okay. Let me tell you real quick. So Newton's ideas about who Jesus was are not orthodox. That means that they didn't follow the church's teaching. So whatever the Westminster Confession says about this is the identity of Jesus didn't fit. It fits more with his understanding of Jesus with a guy named Arius in the 3rd century or 4th century. I don't want to turn around and verify the date exactly. But there's this guy named Arius who said, Jesus is divine, but he's not co-equal with God. He's a little lesser than God. He's begotten of God, right? God made him. And so he's not co-eternal with God. He's a little bit less down here. So this guy named Arius, kind of proponent of this, and he shows up at a conference of all these bishops and elders. The word elder is Presbyterian, presbyter in Greek. So that's why I put that up there. He was a presbyter, he was a presbyter, and he shows up at this conference with his ideas, and people are fighting over this, and there's a guy named Nicholas, right, who just calls out and slaps him right in the face during this conference, this gathering of bishops. And later on, that Nicholas becomes a saint. Saint Nicholas eventually becomes Santa Claus. So, that's a long story there, but that is the one who, sometimes I see friends, they post these memes online. It says that St. Nicholas was and I can't even say a polite word. He was really tough, I will say. He was really tough, and he just slaps heretics all over the place. So anyway, that idea that Jesus was not fully God actually grew in the Christian church, and many people became Arians, different from the word that's associated with Nazism and Arianism. That's a different word. This is named after this guy named Arius. Okay? Yeah, Doug.
Mike, how did the Germanic people become so Aryan?
Okay, so good. Doug, this is where I was just getting to that. So Doug asks, how did the Germanic tribes become Aryan? And I had too many slides, so I took that one off. But to show you the map of where Arianism in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century went. It went among the Germanic tribes, which were all on the move at this time, right? They're moving down from Northern Europe, and they go over here and over there. They're everywhere. They're called Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all the other Goths. My Latin teacher used to say, but he'd say it less politely. So all the Goths, they became Aryans, and they come invading and setting up kingdoms in Italy and Spain, in what's now modern, north of the Black Sea, all over the place. I don't know why exactly it took on among these Germanic tribes, but they are probably just strong missionary efforts among those Aryan Christians who went out to the Germanic tribes. They become this Christian, and only late 7th, 8th, 9th century did they begin to conform to Catholicism. So Doug, thanks, Doug, for that question. I decided that was too much to tell everybody, but now I got the chance to tell you. Arianism is suppressed or subsumed into Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, which says Jesus and God are co-eternal. They're of the same substance, the same two different persons, but the same substance. And Arians say, not quite God. All right? There are Arians today. I have to be careful how I say it, because Mormonism is Mormonism is if you have to, I have to do my math a little more carefully, but Arianism, Jesus is slightly subordinate to God in Mormonism. And so they would be kind of defined as Arian Christians. Now I have to kind of, somebody, I'm sure if there were somebody watching, a Mormon who was watching would be like, no, it's not quite like that. So, but in the time of Isaac Newton, it's dangerous for him to have this thought. And we'll get to that in a moment, how he comes to that thought, okay? How he comes there. Careful biblical study, and what he does. Okay, let me see if I can move us a little quicker here. A lot of these theological thought he didn't publish in his lifetime. When he dies, a lot of his notebooks, all of a sudden, his relatives say, well, look at this. And they start publishing them. And so a new book was found. Let's see if I got that. We got through Resurgence of Arianism, A New Discovery, Newton's Complex Relationship with Christianity. And just even recently, some of these books are coming to thought they were lost. 350 years, nobody knew where they were. And somebody found them on a shelf and said, oh, look, Isaac Newton. So if there's one, the next one is, you'll see his own handwriting here, and in it he's disputing on Romans 14, whatsoever is not faith is sin. I can just read that up in his handwriting up there. But these are books he kept all his life. He was writing about theology and Scripture. He read Scripture, and he read it with a very logical mind. And he had to do public disputations, and where he would stand up for an hour and speak in Latin at these big fancy meetings at Cambridge, and disputing theological points. Most times, all of this stuff kind of got forgotten and lost until they found these books. This book here that you can see contains 12,000 words in English and about 5,000 words in Latin. That's just one disputation. So imagine. You're probably going, well, Mike, you're getting there pretty quick for your 7,000 words. Okay, but let me see. There's going to be lots of words on some of these next slides, and so I want to move us a little bit quickly through these. But Newton's papers reveal his scientific and his theological processes. In these books, that you can see as carefully as he went through his scientific experimentation and his thought experiments in theology, they're both very careful. And he does over years and years and years. He's reading Scripture very carefully. And he's at a time when he has greater access to Hebrew and Greek manuscripts of the Bible. And he can say, hey, David's going to talk about that. There's a place in which he says, this verse doesn't exist in the originals. And so he gets very clear that when he's developing his thoughts, it's a very scientific approach to reading Scripture. All right, let's see what we got here. You'll see some things quickly, just like the one that says omnipresent being. He does believe in God. God is this omnipresent being. Let's just see if I can read a little bit of that. Whence is it that nature doth nothing in vain, and whence arises all that order and beauty which we see in the world? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics, and the ear without knowledge of sounds? Then, in case the reader is not getting the point, he says it more plainly. Does it not appear from phenomena that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent, who is infinite space, sees the things themselves intimately and thoroughly perceives them and comprehends them wholly? And so he has this grand understanding of God, and he says he looks at nature and he sees God reflected, and all of his work points him toward saying, I read somewhere that said all his work in calculus was to prove that God works by the rules of, God created the rules of the universe and lives by them. And so he says that calculus was almost a way of proving the existence of God's ways in the universe. So we don't ever hear that in school, right? But I found that fascinating. So those were the guys in the back with the slides. We're going to move on to the one that's got the picture. It says on the Godhead or the Trinity. So that's coming up real quick. So he did believe that there were three persons of God. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. But they weren't the same. The Orthodox Christianity says they're all one being, but distinct. And the fancy words that are used there are saying they are three persons, but one substance, one being, one homoousios in Greek, okay, fancy word, but it means they're all of one substance, so 3 in 1. And his view was, okay, I believe in God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they're not co-equal, and they're not just one. They're separate. A community of being, but separate. And that we might think, well, that's a little fine-tuning. The church at that time, their ears were really tuned to how people articulated that. And so they were trying really hard to see how much they conformed. So as we move on, Dave is going to talk about 1 John 5:7. I'll say a little bit about, I did say that he was fascinated by the book of Revelation and prophecy, and he really tried to figure out the mathematics of it as he was going along. I'm going to keep us moving. Let's go to the one that says fear of heresy. So in his own day, there was a man named Thomas Aikenhead, executed for anti-Trinitarian opinions in Scotland in 1697. All right, so this is the prime of Newton's life. And this was a shock to those who believed that there was a new liberty to express such opinions, and he was the last person in Great Britain to be executed for blasphemy. All right, so, did I miss a whole slide there about the Salem witch trials? So that was back in the context. Salem witch trials are the 1690s in America, right? Early 1690s. This is 1697 for heresy. And so the witch trials were going on still in England, and over in America still the society is run by these superstitions and the deep sense of conformity. It's also true back in England. Newton lives in a fear that his thoughts on God and Jesus will get him killed. And so he suppresses all of that. So his execution occurs 85 years after, this Aikenhead guy. His execution occurs 85 years after the death of Edward Whiteham, the last person to be burned at the stake for heresy in England, 1612. So no persons were burned in America. They were all either hanged or some other form of death for witchcraft. Right? But I want to put this all into context because we think Isaac Newton's scientific mind, and his culture, though, is not, right? It's a world in which superstition, orthodoxy, conformity are just strong influences on his life. Newton advocates simple Christianity, all right? In the midst of that, he does say, he looks at the church of his day, as did the Puritans, and said, the Church of England, corrupt. There's no saving it. And Newton says, Scripture tells us that again and again and again, God renews the church in significant ways. There was Moses, there was Jesus who renewed spirituality in a new way. He was looking for his own time, saying there must be another renewal of the church because the church is corrupt. And so let me just read this simple Christianity. In Newton's time, heterodox, that's heresy, heterodox Protestants, non-Orthodox Protestants, such as himself, believed that the Reformation had only been partly successful and that a more precise, simple form of religion needed to be reinstated. At his most ambitious, therefore, Newton implicitly placed himself in a line of restorers of true religion, including Christ and Moses. All right? And I got one more slide that'll give us a nice bridge over to the work that David did in reading The Priest of Nature. To some degree, Newton saw himself as a modern version of an ancient priest, a true priest, he says, morally entitled to be the guardian of the elite knowledge he had attained in a number of different pursuits. By extension, the Principia was the modern version of the Word of God. This is his Mathematica, Principia Mathematica. Modern version of the Word of God to which the original priesthood paid homage. It perfectly exemplified such knowledge accessible to none but the worthy few. Sounds a little bit Gnostic to me, Gnosticism. Gnosticism is based in knowledge. Knowledge is the way to God. So let's see what David came up with in his reading then of the Priest of Nature and what he's got. Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is against my better judgment, but I was told to say, what do you get when you take the circumference of the sun and divide it by its radius? Pi in the sky today is Pi Day 3314. All right, well, we'll move on from that, but many professional scientists think Isaac Newton is the greatest scientist of all time, even surpassing Albert Einstein, just because of the vast amount of his output on all sorts of different subjects. But most people during his lifetime, Newton was regarded as a scientist and nothing else. So all this work on religion and alchemy, it was hidden. He didn't want it published. He was very secretive about it. But when his papers were discovered in the early 20th centuries, they were scattered all over the place, and they've gradually been reaccumulated, and people are putting together all these sources. In fact, there's a big Newton project where all of his papers are being gathered online so anybody can access them now, and that's still an ongoing project. So anyway, there's several good and not so good resources on Newton. The Priest of Nature, the religious world of Isaac Newton, is my primary source. I somehow got through this. It's a brutal, very difficult book, but at least it covers all of Newton's religious stuff. And then even worse is Newton the Alchemist. I only got about 40% of the way through this and gave up. It's very difficult, very challenging, and I think the author didn't intend for it to be read by one straight through. I think they intended it as a reference source. And so I would recommend easier books like The Clockwork Universe, Isaac Newton, The Royal Society, and The Birth of the Modern World. This is much more accessible. I've only read a portion of it, but it's much easier to do. All right, so Isaac Newton, he became a fellow at Trinity College at Cambridge University. Now, if you go to Cambridge University, it's composed of about 30 different colleges, and if you go there, you live at the one you're assigned to, and you share the whole resources of the university, but each of them has its own size, its own features. Some have private libraries, some have British pubs and everything. And so I know about this because I was lucky enough to attend a scientific conference there for a week and celebrating the legacy of Charles Darwin. And so there was a distinct pecking order of, like, you were really cool, like if you were in Trinity College or King's College, and not so cool if you were in one of the newer ones. But anyway, Newton was recognized for his extraordinary intellectual skill, and he was assigned to Trinity College. And the minute he got out, he became the second Luca Sayan, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, professor, and that's probably the single most prestigious scientific appointment in the world. Like, following in Newton's footsteps, there was Paul Dirac, who was part of the atomic bomb creation, and then Stephen Hawking was also in that position, and almost all of them were very famous
That's why
professors.
I didn't say it earlier because I can't pronounce the name either. So,
yeah, it's very, very difficult. But so his gifts, his intellectual gifts, were recognized extremely early. And one thing especially cool is that Newton lobbied the king and said, well, I'm supposed to be a scientist. If I also have to be an Anglican priest, that'll take too much time away from me. I want to be a scientist only, and the king agreed. So henceforward, they have a regulation. You're actually not allowed to be actively involved in the church if you're in that seat. And that fit into Newton's goals just precisely. Now, what did Newton do? Why is he famous? Well, he discovered that light, by using a prism, is composed of different colors. So white light is a combination from multiple colors, and you can spread out the spectrum. And what's really cool, it goes from ultraviolet to dark red, and if you move a thermometer a little further away from the dark red, the temperature goes up. So the prism actually refracts infrared light. So that's how infrared was discovered. There was even longer wavelength light that was primarily heat rather than totally invisible to the human eye. So he was famous for that. He was famous with the Newtonian reflecting telescope because that didn't have chromatic aberration. It was primarily used mirrors, and so that was an easier way to observe astronomically. And all the telescopes like the James Webb Space Telescope are all basically Newtonian reflecting telescopes. So there's a giant mirror rather than a giant lens. But he's especially important for one of the two people that independently came up with calculus. And how many people have had a year or more of calculus here? Okay, some of you have got about half of you. That's pretty good. Now, what calculus is it's concerned with a whole range of numbers, and so it's typically a calculus expression. You start with f of x equals some equation, and which also corresponds to the y-axis on a piece of graph paper, and you have a curve usually, and with calculus you can figure out where the minimum and maxima and the area under the curve and stuff like that. But what Newton did is he realized that gravity obeys the law f of x equals 1 over x squared. So if the force of gravity at point 1 is 1, if you move to number f of x is 2, that's 1 over x squared, so that means 1/4 the value. So you only move 1 unit further on, and it drops to 1/4 the value. You move out to 3 units, it's 1/9, 3 squared. And then so on at 4, it's 1/16. So the force of gravity tapers off quite rapidly. So here on the surface of the Earth, you can feel gravity quite distinctly, but if you're orbiting the Earth, you don't really feel the gravity as much because you're further away from the center of the Earth, and so it's much less strong. Likewise, if you're on the surface of the moon, it's like about 1/4 of what it would be on the Earth, just because the mass of the moon is much smaller. All right, but most scientists, though, what they know Newton for is his classical mechanics, which is centered around the equation force equals mass times acceleration, F equals ma. And believe me, you can write a 1,000-page book on all the fun stuff you can do with F equals ma, and that's usually the mechanics course is the big weed out course for the physics major, and that ended up tripping me up. I was one of its victims. I was used to getting A's, and I got a C- in that, and I switched to geology as my major after that. And they got to go on cool field trips, and it wasn't generally not as much mathematics, but depending on the field, it can be just as bad. So anyway, Newton published his book with all this rigorous development of classical mechanics, and why he's so famous is he beat it into the ground. He didn't just say these are the equations. He started out from the most elementary level, like 1 is greater than 0, a couple really fundamental assumptions, and then he proved other things, and then he finally got into the mechanics. So he made his mathematic bulletproof, more bulletproof, and just beyond belief. You know, no other scientist has ever been so rigorous with mathematics, and it's, you know, killed many students, including me. So anyway, Newton didn't invent Kepler's law. There's a diagram on the handout, and that's just to, I'm not going to go into all the details, you know, one of which is planet circling the sun. It has an elliptical orbit, and the sun's at one of the two elliptical focuses. But what he did is you can derive Kepler's laws extremely easily by algebra, and once upon a time I knew how to do that, and not off the top of my head I can do that anymore, but I've done it, it's pretty easy. But what Newton does, he started with the 1 over x squared gravitational law, and it came out that Kepler's laws immediately follow from just that one statement about the force of gravity and how it varies. So that really makes it, that kind of tied everything together and showed he was on the right track. Now, Newton only spent about a third of his entire scientific output on science. The other approximately 1/3 was on alchemy. Now, chemistry got off to a really bad start. They didn't come across the periodic table of the elements early on. They thought all the elements could be mutated into each other and moved around, you know, rather than about 150 or so distinct chemical elements. So chemistry was way off track for quite a few years, and so even Newton thought, well, I can transform lead to silver and then silver to gold. But he was on the wrong track, but he tried. And what was so difficult about the literature about alchemy is that there was fear that if some criminal could figure out how to synthesize gold, it would be a very bad thing. So it was deliberately kept obscure, and alchemists writing about it, they were writing for only those elite people that already were in the know. So it was like very secretive language, which turns out it was the wrong mistake, because later on in Newton's life there was a question about not only who developed calculus first, but who developed the inverse square law, because Newton was so cautious about what he committed to paper. So only late in his life did he spell out stuff in actual detail. Now, religious scholarship was also the other approximately 1/3 of his output. He was an excessive Bible study person. And he was, as Michael Hegeman pointed out, that Jesus had a subordinate position to God and the Holy Spirit as well. And I didn't realize until just last week, I've spent like the last 4 months reading all about Newton, and I didn't realize that the ancestor of Newton's religious thought is the Unitarian Universalist Church, where you go there and Jesus is around, but he's not the main thing, and Mormonism likewise. So it's not that obscure, or that's not that arcane to believe that Jesus is not quite as important as God. In fact, in anti-Trinitarianism, Jesus is in the Muslim faith, Jesus is just a prophet too. He's an important person, and Muhammad as well is just a prophet. So Jesus and Muhammad are nowhere near the equal of God, but they are carriers of a message, and they're still very important people. And so Newton was convinced that Trinitarianism was something that was distortion of the original Christian message. So in the 3rd and the 4th century, when there all these councils in Nicaea and other places, he was convinced that in the oldest biblical writings, the passages concerning Trinitarianism were not there. And in fact, he succeeded in finding some very old Bibles, and those passages weren't there in all of them. It's still controversial because there are other Bibles that are quite ancient and do address Trinitarianism. So John 5:7 says there are 3 that testify, suggesting a threefold aspect to God. And then 1 Timothy 3:16, it excessively, or at least in Newton's view, it excessively glorifies Jesus, like he was revealed in flesh, vindicated in spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the Gentiles, believed in throughout the world, taken up in glory. And Newton thought that was just way too strong. But we'll see. Most Christians don't believe that, but others, Muslims do, and Unitarians do as well. Now, he was especially focused on biblical chronology. He was convinced that all the events that happened in the book of Revelations, some of them had already happened, but others were about to happen. And I think at one point with some of his friends, he got together and figured out the world likely might end in the year 2060. He figured that out by all these hidden numerical codes in the Bible. So we'll see what happens. We maybe don't have that many years to live yet. So all kinds of, but he spent considerable amount of scholarship. But he didn't entirely reject Jesus. He felt that Jesus should be worshipped because he was obedient, and he suffered on the cross and brought an important message, and so he was worthy to be exalted, and so he was important, but just not as important as God himself. Now, as far as God's role in creating the universe, many modern scientists believe the same thing, that somehow, and this is also known as the anthropomorphic principle, is that the sun gives out exactly the appropriate light and heat to the planets, and they were just at the right distance from the sun, traveled in just the right orbits, which nearly circular in the case of Earth, has just the right mass and just the right amount of gravitational power, and they revolved at just the right rate and all that. But all that must be true because we wouldn't be here if all those factors weren't true. But what a lot of modern scientists believe, there's so many combinations of factors that led to life emerging on the planet Earth that we may be alone in the universe. So we better not mess things up, because you literally do need all of those factors for life to occur. So the universe is definitely not going to be like Star Trek, where the starship visits a different planet, every hour. That literally life is likely to be incredibly rare throughout the universe and perhaps unique to the planet Earth. So it's really amazing that Newton had these thoughts, hundreds of years ago and all that, and those same topics are still talked about in the faith and science circles. And it's a big area for research with the Vatican, where they have the Vatican Astronomical Observatory on Mount Graham and outside of Tucson, and they're working on the prospect of life elsewhere in the universe. So it's a very ongoing thing. But to conclude my portion here, Newton wrote that there was no way to come up with the knowledge of the deity but by the study of nature. And he said that anyone of keen mind from any group of people, so there are no unique, specially privileged people, that might gather the truth from it and come to know God from his works. And he saw his role as a priest of nature, studying the earth and how it operates and how the planets work. That was the best way to understand who God is. All right, so I guess we're going to question and answers after that.
Thank you, Dave. I see a couple people are just coming in, so hopefully there wasn't a confusion about the time. But we're glad you're here. So we'll move into that. I'll just have one more thing to say. Kind of my thoughts as I was reading all of this as a church person is to saying, like, what is the role of the nonconformist in the society? You know, somebody who has ideas about God that don't quite fit maybe the kind of the orthodox path, and the tension that those people live with against in his day, church, government-controlled church and church-controlled government. There isn't a separation of church and state in any way, and so he really did live when somebody, his own contemporary, could be put to death for non-Trinitarian thoughts, right? So I was thinking about that. That's one of the ideas that I've been most intrigued about his life, that he can continue to have such a deep intellectual faith, and yet in a time when there's all these pressures. Are you Protestant? Are you Catholic? Are you something else? And there's all this upheaval in society, and yet he finds a path in the midst of that, both which out of that path grows quite a scientific worldview as well, a scientific path. So grateful for him for so many ways, and I think we're only going to learn more as you all read all of these books, right? And we figure out more about his contributions, what they could be in the world of faith and religion. All right. So the way we do this is we really do need you to, if you have a question, to speak into a microphone so that it picks it up for both our recording and if there's anybody online with us. We're glad they're there too. So this one's going to get passed away. I think Kim passed around. Kim is going to.
In your discussion, there is a book written a number of years ago, but it's been redone by Rhodes in The Atomic Bomb. And it talks about, for the first 200 pages, about the scientists and their beliefs. Much of comes out of Newton. Like, for instance, Niels Bohr questions conformity, questions everything. And they're extremely deep-thinking people that are trying to look at nature and make it mathematical in the same way as Newton, eventually developing the atom bomb. And it's a good book to read to go to bed because it's about 800 pages thick. Okay.
Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, all the scientists, especially those involved with the atomic bomb project, were very concerned about what it would lead to. They were really afraid that they were opening up Pandora's box, and most of the scientists that were involved in creating the atomic bomb were very moral people and were very concerned it didn't spread, or if it had to be used, it'd be used once or twice and that's it. And so far the world, it's been 80 years or so since an atomic bomb was used, and hopefully none will ever be used again.
For either of you, I had a question about what was his relationship with the English monarchs at the time. Somebody, I assume, knighted him, because I think he's Sir Isaac Newton, but did he get along with them, or was the academic world that he was in totally separate from from the royal courts?
Yes, he was recognized by the government. He was knighted by Queen Anne, and he spent 2 very brief terms as a member of Parliament. He didn't do very much, but what was extremely significant, he was appointed to be the director of the Royal Mint, which was a very prestigious and largely honorary post, but he actually took it incredibly seriously because there were big problems with counterfeit money, and he really worked to stamp out the counterfeit currency. So that was in acknowledgement of his extraordinary contributions to society.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
So I'm glad Dave knew as much as he did on that one, because what I knew is just that he was able to petition the king at some point, and the king granted him. They had said, you don't have to be a priest to continue in this role you serve. But I think that, like David said, there is an ongoing relationship. These kings, monarchs, are aware of him, throughout this whole time.
Newton seemed to be pretty worried about the consequences of being a heretic in the eyes of the Presbyterian Church or the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, I guess, at the time. If you were to fast forward it, would he still be a heretic now, or would he be welcomed into one or more of those churches? Or would he just be a generic, maybe Christian, I guess, or not even that?
One of the things that we see out of that, and it's definitely, that from the time of Queen Elizabeth I on, so the late 1500s, the 1500s into the 1600s, there is this constant tug about how Catholic, how Protestant the church will be. But in the 1640s, that time we have the influence of Scottish Presbyterianism as well. And so that's just, everybody's trying to figure out who are we and how do we define our Christianity. I would say that it is fascinating that one little thing like Newton saying, I'm not going to be ordained. And then probably within 100 to 150 years, we see that rule is completely gone for anybody teaching at universities. And somebody could say, oh, it's such a slippery slope. Look at England now, that they're so secular, and that we see in the 1900s the great rise of Marxism in some of these universities. So atheism and Marxism are hand to hand, or side by side with folks like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, also in the same universities. I'm sorry, I'll get to your question, I think. But we see that that secularism and faith-based, are both present in those places. But I think some of the benefits we see is a loosening of control of the church. At the same time, we see that then we have nonconformity is kind of the name of the game, and that's so much so that almost that Christianity within these universities is unusual. And I understand how would I say all that, but answering the question, what would he be today? My thought on this track was, would he, if 100 years later, 200 years later, how far would he have gone? Would he have kept any kind of connection to faith if the culture hadn't been so faith-based at the time, and how much pressure? 100 years, would he have been one of those who would just, faith wasn't even part of the equation anymore? I would hope so, because he's got such a deep and keen mind about faith. But would he be called a heretic today? It might not matter, because he probably wouldn't be part of any of those churches that would have any consequence over him, any kind of consequence over him. David, do you have that?
Well, Newton very much wanted the Anglican Church, the Church of England, to separate itself as much as possible from the Roman Catholic Church, because he thought the Pope had too much power. He didn't believe the bread and the wine were the actual blood and body of Jesus. So he wanted to pry the Anglican Church just as far apart as possible and make it a true Protestant church like the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. Because at first, when the Anglican Church broke off from the Roman Catholic Church from Henry VIII, there was not much change. It was still fundamentally the Roman Catholic Church, just without a pope. But I would see him being very comfortable in a progressive liberal church. I would think he would be comfortable at Pinnacle Presbyterian, for instance.
Maybe prompt a question or two, prompt a question or two. So thinking about that idea about how is it that conformity, you know, the sense of, are there pressures even for us? I mean, you think in our culture today, what ways do we see a conformity to at least appear Christian? So thinking about that idea, is there places in American society where to be either in power of some kind, somebody has to appear Christian to maintain that power? Or to have access to avenues of power? You're kind of all going, I just come out and say it. I don't think somebody currently could be elected a president unless they had some kind of connection to, even in our day, at least being perceived as associated with a Christian church. It might change, but you look back at you could go back to the 1700s. Fun to explore is the rise of deism after the time of Newton, which is a much more rational approach to faith and spirituality, but many of our founding fathers were probably fit into that category of deism, a very rational form of Christianity or faith. So that Thomas Jefferson himself did the kind of work, deep biblical study, but he also had his X-Acto knife where he cut out the parts he didn't like that were too mystical or he wanted a very rational Jesus. He wanted a good teacher, a good moral teacher. And so in some ways he's following in the vein of Newton's very exacting biblical study, but also carrying on that idea of let's look at it logically and rationally. Where was I going with all that? But I've met even people today saying, "Oh yeah, it was too bad that Jefferson was a president because he wasn't a Christian." So, but you can argue that, certainly. But I think even today, we're not as far removed from this whole question about this tension between church and state, how much the perception of being conforming to a religious religious perspective affects you. Sorry, right over. Who's got the microphone now? Oh,
I
Beth,
have
do
the
it, Beth.
microphone.
Yeah.
I have a very basic question. Did he marry?
I tried to find out as much. No, of course he did not. He did not marry. And if you type in the question, was Isaac Newton gay? It's very ambiguous. Nobody wants to say. Answer that question as far as I could find. There are points with he lives with men. He writes to them as my beloved so and so. We just don't know enough about the culture. Celibacy was expected, but the best I could read was saying that people call him asexual. So, but I was just intrigued by that myself, as saying he stepped away. I know I'm not going to be a priest, but did he ever have relationships? No, at some point he has a niece that comes and lives with him, and her husband, they take care of him later in life. He never marries, but he actually lives with other men throughout his life. We don't know anything. I don't know anything more about that. Yeah.
The question was, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, add something to that. Newton was, at one point early in his career, he signed a vow of celibacy, but then later on that wasn't important. He wasn't going to be penalized if he was, but he was very upset about these monks that had gone to monasteries and decided to take a vow of celibacy, because many of these monks were married, and they would go into the monastery, and so they were used to having sex, and Newton thought it was a bad thing because they knew that both the monks would have sex with somebody and their wives would have sex with other guys and commit adultery. So he was very much against vows of celibacy, but he himself, though, felt he was so strong that he could resist everything, and he chose to be celibate. And none of the material I've read suggested he was gay. In fact, he spent the last 30 years of his life living in London, where he was around men and women, and seemed to be much happier in that environment rather than in Cambridge University, where it was basically an entirely male world.
Okay, getting back to the reference of how we feel and conforming to faith and different ideas in today's society. I personally partake in a international Bible study that is not at this church, and it's all over the world. And I do not conform to a lot of their beliefs, so I keep quiet. They are evangelicals, so everything they believe in the Bible is literal. And they're not supposed to talk about their church views, their international denominations, but sometimes it comes up in conversations. So it is not an open dialogue that we have at our church where we try to share ideas. So there is points in society where we do not speak up if the majority is other than us. So it is a daily occurrence in our society where you keep quiet, I think. I mean, the Presbyterian Church is a Reformed church, so we view the Bible in current situations, in today's living. And the evangelicals don't view it in a Reformed manner.
Thank you for that comment. You know, it is we all face challenges of how safe do we feel about expressing our views about God. You know, I remember once when I was in seminary, and I had written, it was in a theology class, but I had written a hymn, and I changing the language, the male language of the Trinity to female language, and I presented it in a what we call a precept, which is a small discussion group around a topic, a thought in the class. And just exploration, you know, and Mother, Child, and Birthing Spirit, oh, hear us now, we pray, right? And the preceptor, the PhD student who was running that, he says, Mr. Hegeman will be presenting today, and it appears that he is a heretic, right? And so we are still friends today. This is 30 years later now, and he did write to me a couple of days, last week he just wrote to me. So we are friends, but that was an unusual experience for me, just for even the possibility of saying, what would it sound like if we did this? And he was clear that was a heretical move. And so I was branded as such a heretic early on in my education. But there is, you know, and I learned when to speak up and when not to speak up. But and I wouldn't want to group all evangelicals the same, you know, that way. There are some people who call themselves evangelicals who do deep study in Scripture, where they look at historical context and they do all that. So I wouldn't want to group everyone together, or even any of us in this room, that we conform in some way to a expectation or a model. Yeah. So right here.
Sort of going back to your political question, we'll go to old-time political people, so the deists, who were some of our founding fathers, sort of thing. From an evangelical, conservative point of view, would they be considered Christians?
No, I've had people who absolutely say no. You know, they'll say, like Thomas Jefferson specifically, they'll say, "Oh, he was not a Christian. There's no reason to listen to him or think about him. Oh, no, not a Christian." And so, and I'll say, you know, let's take a second look at that. And I would invite them. You know, this was teaching at a a Christian university. And students, oh no, or even other faculty, nope, we don't listen to Thomas Jefferson. And I'd say, well, tell me more about that. Let's look at this in a different way. And I would just invite them to say, I think there's some things that I could say profoundly Christian about Thomas Jefferson, and not. So I didn't want people to shut the door completely right away, but yeah. So go ahead, another one. Oh, Spike.
I have a follow-up question
Yes.
to that. So a former minister here, two former ministers actually, sat down one time, according to one of them, and they made a list of what are the things that you have to believe in to be Christian. And they both agreed that the one thing was the divinity of Jesus, which would make make Sir Isaac Newton, quote, not a Christian.
What the language I did read was that he did consider Jesus divine, but slightly under God, right? So God is first and primal, and that Jesus is one of God's creations. God made Jesus. And this is that early church debated about this for 3 centuries before they came up with the creed that said he is co-eternal with the Father, consubstantial, meaning of the same substance or being with the church, early church, and this is what Newton didn't like. He says, the Bible I believe in. He says the early church councils and all of their philosophizing, I didn't believe, that's using fancy Greek words to try to figure this all out. That's what he didn't like. But what I did read is that he did believe in, quote unquote, the divinity of Jesus. And I would say that as much as I know about Mormons, believe in the divinity of Jesus, yet he is subordinate to the Father in some way, And yeah, but that's what so would he consider himself a Christian, or would he be welcome among us? Okay, well, thank you. All right.
Hi, my question is, did you guys unravel what his motivations were? I mean, was his study of science to learn more about religion? Did religion help motivate him to study science? Why did he choose these topics?
Yes, he primarily seems to have done science primarily to understand God, so religion seems to be the primary motivational factor. I mean, science was very important to him, but it gave him his energy and his drive to try to understand something about God. And he was quite deeply religious, but yet he apparently felt very uncomfortable as being perceived as a heretic, because right then the Anglican Church wasn't that much different than the Roman Catholic Church, and he sought to have a little more distance from the Roman Catholic Church.
That's a good question to go back to, and maybe I'll read some of the books that David has read too and look for that. What motivated him? But I think for any of us, what motivates us to go into the fields we do, especially those who appear and are on the edge of genius. I mean, Newton really is, his mind is incredible. And yet he wants to hold these two worlds together for himself. So I think that's pretty remarkable. And we're grateful to Kim to running back. Kim is David's wife. So if you don't know Kim,
well, then I have a follow-up question
Sure.
about the scientific community, because I think about things like Fibonacci, right? So there was a scientific feeling that this is, when you see things in nature that can be explained through science, it's proof that there is a God. So did that happen before or after, or was that a contemporary of Newton?
I don't know. The Fibonacci and the Fibonacci sequence again is a lovely. It's a mathematical approach to something that is quite beautiful in nature, right? These sequences, the golden mean, they call it. There's things that show up again in nature that they've named. Maybe David will help me out if Fibonacci comes after Newton or not. But where was I thinking about that? One of the things is that some folks make that move too simply. They just say, oh, well, I've never want to stop somebody from going out and marveling at nature and saying, I experience God here. But other folks might say, they might come up with saying, well, this proves that there's a God. and they make that leap too simply. And I would say Newton is somebody who didn't make that leap. He doesn't make a leap. He is very methodical about his approach and looking at all of that. And so he's not, I wouldn't say that he never made any leaps, but he's one who is approaching and trying to discover God and the rules by which God runs the universe. He's creating this scientific method and approach that David talked about too, is that he's not going to publish anything that he hasn't. He starts with the basic. 1 is greater than 0, and then we get all the way to that in-depth calculus. But that's my thought, is that Newton isn't somebody, or maybe I'd have to research Fibonacci a little bit more, who comes up with that sequence of looking at that amazing harmonies of nature, and that are all, that clearly mathematical and yet beautiful, mathematical and beautiful, causing awe, but not to make easy leaps. Oh, sure, no, that proves that God's here. Saying, oh, we're just so far from the sun, we have just the right mass, all those things. Some people would make that leap too easily. Well, that must prove there's God. For me, myself, I want to go, prove it a little more. Something like that. I want to go a little more. I might want to say, oh, that's amazing, that's wonderful. But there's a little skeptic in me that wants to say, does that prove that God is for me? I'm not sure yet, but I'm willing to go on that journey with them, definitely.
Yeah, Newton actually believed that his mathematical skills would give him a leg up on competing biblical scholars, because he believed there was a lot of hidden mathematics in the scriptures. And then, because he just literally tore apart the book of Revelations looking for numerical clues when certain events would happen in the world. And he believed that only somebody as powerful as God, who had the skills of geometry and calculus and everything, could have created a universe where everything was so perfectly in balance to allow the emergence of life. So science and religion were very much entangled, but he thought that mathematics was kind of the key to unlock the doors of everything.
You all are doing well. It's a deep thought we both experienced, that entering into the world of John Locke, but he's in there too. Isaac Newton is daunting, really was daunting, and I found things that immediately came to the surface for me that I could relate to, and other things felt so distant, and I was listening to that book, so I'd have to go back and go, what? But it was really worth the journey. And I'm thinking, now I've got other paths to go through too, to really discovering who is this figure, what place did he play in history, but saying, but my question comes, is there room for me in the world? Saying, how much nonconformist am I? There's some things which I'm sure I would have been put to death for 200 years ago. So I just think that watching how he explored his faith and understanding and knowledge, and it was all about exploring and discovery, and seeing a great, I don't say map, but something that he could plot to kind of help him understand the universe. And so I'm intrigued on this journey to really explore more about him and find that worthwhile. David, do you think you're going to explore more, or are you going to take a break from Isaac Newton?
I can talk a lot more. Newton was incredibly competitive, and he had a really interesting relationship with his fellow scientists. In 1666, the city of London burned down, and it was suspected that people that had connections to the Pope were responsible, or at least they were a convenient victim or fall guy for it all. But Christopher Wren was an architect, and he was hired to rebuild all the churches of London, most especially St. Paul's Cathedral. And then the structural engineer was a guy named Robert Hooke, who was a pioneer in microscopy and is famous for Hooke's law that has to do with the power of springs. But Hooke was not one to have the mathematical rigor of Newton, and Hooke claimed that he discovered the inverse square law for gravitational force, and Newton got quite angry, and he decided, okay, I'm going to establish I'm the one that owns this. I'm going to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and he did. And so Hooke and Newton had kind of a bad relationship for most of their lives, but there's no doubt Hooke was brilliant. And if you're ever in London, I highly recommend the building that Robert Hooke designed, the Monument to the Great Fire, which is a pillar, and it has an incredibly steep staircase going up to the top. But that was all designed by Robert Hooke. But he was a very much had an uncomfortable relationship with Newton. But Newton did such a rigorous job with his mathematics that he's the one now perceived to be the major inventor or discoverer of that fact.
And you and I both hiked to the very top of the Monument to the Fire and St. Paul's in the same day.
Yeah, one right after another, and that's really cool. Yes.
The thing that's so important that we today must think is Newtonian physics went just so far. And I don't know how many of you studied physics or atomic physics or physical chemistry, and when you study the atom, the rules don't apply. There's a whole set of new rules of which randomness, time, enter in the functions of light that were studied in the early 1900s, in the 19th century and the 20th century, and that we must question what's our next knowledge that we as human beings can learn about what we are and where we are. And that because Newtonian physics works real good, but it doesn't work for the atom. And it doesn't work for deep space and time. And many of the physicists are very strongly religious because they don't understand this and want to be smart enough to think that maybe randomness and things that are beyond their understanding are out there.
Newtonian mechanics works superbly, but we have to be above the atomic scale, and the only time Newtonian mechanics breaks down is at extreme velocities and in extreme gravitational fields, and that's what Einstein came up with. But quantum mechanics, which deals with the very small, and results are largely in terms of mathematical probabilities, that was discovered mostly in the very beginning of the 20th century, in the 1910s, the 1920s, and still nobody really understands what's going on with quantum mechanics. That's a completely different world into itself, but Newton had obviously no tools whatsoever capable of exploring things on an atomic scale.
It's like David mentioned the Great Fire of 1666, and what happened in 1665 in London was the Great Plague. And so, and I had to research which kind of plague was that. It's a recurrence 300 years after the bubonic plague of bubonic plague. And 15% of the city of London dies in the bubonic plague again. And at that time, people are saying it's the humors. They're trying to name what the cause of this is. It's bad air. They don't have, like David says, they didn't have the tools at that time to name the the pest, which was in the fleas on the rats, the yarn, I've forgotten the exact word for the bacteria, Yersinia. So they didn't know. And so at that time, their worldview had to change in order for us to, science, and Newton sets us on this trajectory of doing scientific research that, I think he would, I would almost wonder that he would applaud that his understanding would fall short and somebody else would take up that mantle to bring us into the next stage of understanding. So, yeah, it's important. We've got a couple of minutes left, and anybody here who thought, what did you come out for tonight? Did you think, did we meet that expectation? So, any thought, anybody else saying, oh yeah, I was hoping to learn this, or I'm glad I learned this? Oh, Spike, good. Spike will, go ahead. Kim, one more.
It was exactly as advertised, faith and science. Can't beat it.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. We'll get information out to you about next Faith and Science. And so if you're not on our mailing list for the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life, please let me know and we'll get you on there. I think there's something coming up in early April. We've got 2 more Faith and Science this spring, and that's one is on climate change and politics, and the other one is about gender and music. So a professor from ASU is coming. I'm sorry, I can't remember. I'll look it up, okay? And we'll get that information out to you. And of course, always on our website, thefranparkcenter.org, online under events. You'll see all of our upcoming Faith and Science. At the beginning of this, before we started tonight, I did say in the future, next year, we're looking at maybe different ways. We're so glad so many people came out tonight, but saying, is this the best time? Is there another time during our week that Faith and Science would work better? So we're going to send that question out to you at some point and let you get some feedback to us. And what topics would you like to see in our Faith and Science series? We're so grateful for David Schaller to join us tonight. Again, he's one of the founding members of Faith and Science Roundtable here at Pinnacle Presbyterian Church, and working with not Lily, but somebody gave us a grant a long time ago for this work. But if there's the ongoing work of the Fran Park, Templeton, thank you. The ongoing work of the Fran Park Center continues through the support of folks just like you. So if there's any way that you would like to give directly to the Fran Park Center, we'd always want to talk to you about that. Anybody joining us online or on the recording, thank you for joining us as well. And if we want to, any way that you want to support the Fran Park Center, you can see Eric Kubarian back there. Reverend Kubarian is our director for the Fran Park Center, as well as I'm the director for education in the Fran Park Center. All things and hospitality and keeping us running. So thank you all very much, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thank you for joining the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life. Our mission is to serve the church and community through innovative, inclusive, and transformative education. Check out our website at www.franparkcenter.org for more information about upcoming events, programs, pilgrimages, and opportunities to get involved. If you enjoyed this program and would like to see more like it, please consider a donation. You can find more information of ways to support the Park Center on our website.